Die Gedanken sind frei.
My thoughts freely flower.
Die Gedanken sind frei.
The purpose of Freethought Forum is to be vigilant to the encroachment of religion into government and to educate the general public as to what a freethinker is.
No person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei. No person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei.
I think as I please.
Hello, my name is Hugh Henry. This is Freethought Forum. I'm here with Mr. Richard Schoenig, and we're going to discuss the Treaty of Tripoli. The 1796 treaty is important because in it the United States denies that it's a Christian country. But first, let me introduce my guest. Dr. Schoenig was born and raised in Bergenfield, New Jersey, a suburb of New York City. He received a B.S. in chemistry from Fordham University in the Bronx. He later received a Ph.D. in chemistry from the University of Notre Dame. After a 2-year stint as officer in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, he earned an M.A. and a Ph.D. in philosophy from Indiana University, Bloomington. He's published a variety of chemistry and philosophical journals and has written popular articles for magazines such as The Humanist and The American Rationalist. He is currently a professor of philosophy at San Antonio College. When not trying to figure out the meaning of life, he can be found grousing about politics, doing crossword puzzles, working on physical fitness, especially playing basketball, and enjoying mountains of West Texas, Fort Davis, southwestern Colorado, Silverton, with his wife Myrna. I will first set the stage with pirates, and at the end of my introduction, connection with 2 Humphrey Bogart films. The treaty was signed with a group of states, Tripoli, Tunis, Morocco, Algiers in North Africa, then known as the Barbary Pirates, who had been pirates for 1,000 years, perhaps longer. During the Middle Ages, they had repeatedly raided the French Riviera, looting, raping, and enslaving so that it was mostly depopulated. They used galleys until in the 17th century, a Flemish renegade did them the favor of teaching them how to build modern sailing vessels. They then mounted raids clear to Iceland. More than 20,000 captives were said to be imprisoned in Algiers alone. For a while, the Knights of Malta were a check on their piracy. At first, this was because of the Knights' self-appointed Christian duty, but it became a protection racket, one of many associated with the Barbary pirates. The Knights grew wealthy on tribute, and, if it wasn't received, they let the pirates know who was fair game. It is a fictional history of this tribute that figures in the Maltese Falcon. Large nations such as England preferred to pay tribute instead of wiping out the pirates. The pirates lessened commercial competition, a sentiment still around in 1816. Before 1776, American ships flew British flags and were protected by British tribute. During the war, we were protected by tribute from our ally France. After the war, beginning 1783, we were on our own and needed to pay our own tribute, signing treaties with these states. Morocco stayed bought for cheap. Other Barbary states, especially Tripoli, did not. For the next 15 years, pirates demanded payments and still captured ships and ransomed crews. The United States built a Navy, a Marine Corps, which dropped in from time to time until the Tripotolian War of 1804, when we imposed our will. From this war comes the shores of Tripoli of the Marine hymn. Algiers needed another visit in 1816. British anti-slavery sentiments forced a devastating British attack in 1816, but the piracy problem remained until the French invaded and colonized the region in 1830. In the 1840s, Casablanca was colonized again by Rick's Cafe in the movie Casablanca. Also in common between the 2 Bogart films are Henry Greenstreet and Peter Lorre, but I digress. It's Richard's turn now. Richard?
Well, thank you, Hugh, and it's a pleasure to be here again. I thought I'd start by giving some basic facts about the treaty itself. The official name was Treaty of Peace and Friendship between the United States of America and the Bey, B-E-Y, by the way. It's a title for a Muslim ruler. Sometimes it's spelled D-E-Y. in case you're looking this up. The Bey and subjects of Tripoli of Barbary. Barbary basically refers to the Muslim South Mediterranean coast thereby. And as Hugh said, it includes Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and some include Turkey in that. The treaty was authored on our side by one Joel Barlow of Connecticut, who was a somewhat notable diplomat, poet, writer, and political thinker of his day. On November 4th, 1796, Barlow concluded the negotiations on the treaty with Yusuf Basha Mahomet, the Bey of Tripoli. The treaty itself is relatively short. You can read it in less than 5 minutes. It has 12 articles, most of them dealing with commercial matters, maritime trade, and guarantees of safe passage for U.S. shipping in return for payments and other considerations from the U.S. to Tripoli, which is to say extortion, of course. Of the 12 articles, one is of interest to us today. It's the famous or infamous 11th article. It has had some interest because of its use by those who oppose the idea that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. Those who oppose this we might call separationists, and those who favor that the United States was founded as a Christian nation we'll call accommodationists. So separationists have used or tried to use the Article 11 as a buttress for their position. The article reads as follows. Again, it's not that long. As the government of the United States of America is not founded in any sense on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Mussulmen, that is to say Muslims, and as the said states, the United States, have never entered into any war or act of hostility against any Mahometan nation, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries. So there you have it, Article 11. Similar treaties were negotiated with other Barbary states at around this time, including Algeria and Tunis, and they do not have something equivalent to Article 11. Well, anyway, the treaty then is signed in November of 1796 and is sent back to the United States. By the time it reached the United States, we had a new president. Taking over from George Washington was now John Adams. Adams read the treaty, signed off on it. His Secretary of State, Timothy Pickering, read the treaty, approved it, and President Adams then sent the treaty to the Senate in May of 1797. The treaty was read aloud on the floor of the Senate to all the senators, and printed copies were furnished to each of them as well. There is no record of any dissent or argument about the treaty. It was accepted with a unanimous vote. Ed Buckner notes that there had been 339 recorded votes in the history of the United States Senate up to this time in June of 1797. Of the 339 recorded votes, this was only one of 3 that were unanimous. The full text of the treaty was printed in leading newspapers the next week, and in one instance, at any rate, on the first page. There are no recorded objections to Article 11 from Adams, Pickering, or the senators, nor were there any recorded objections from the public at large. There were no political retributions for any of these men either. In fact, many of them went on to further illustrious service and careers both in and out of government. The treaty remained on the books for about 8 years, at which time it was renegotiated, and Article 11 was not included in the new renegotiated treaty. Although there was an article that said that the United States did not recognize any particular religion as official. Now, the importance of this for separationists is obviously in the first phrase, I guess, as the government of the United States is not founded in any sense on the Christian religion. And they have cited this as evidence. I think we have to keep in mind now that most separationists are not saying that this is conclusive and overwhelming evidence in and of itself. It is a piece of the evidence that they want to advance. Accommodationists, on the other hand, have had some issues, of course, with the use of this article. Two objections stand out. One of the objections that I've come across is the contention that Article 11 was only in the English version of the treaty, but it was not in the Arabic version. We have an Arabic version of the treaty, but only one that we got in 1930. We don't know what its provenance is or how it came to have this lack of Article 11. But where Article 11 is, there's nothing but a bunch of pedestrian Arabic gibberish in place. I'm not sure what accommodationists feel they are, what point they're actually making in citing this, because we do know that the English version had Article 11 in, and that's the only thing that separationists need to make their point that this is a piece of evidence. So the fact that it wasn't in the Arabic version seems to be of no consequence in terms of the overall evaluation of Article 11 as evidence. The other objection is somewhat more significant. I think you probably will have something further to say on it too. And this is the contention that Article 11 was, in a sense, grudgingly accepted under some sort of duress because the U.S. needed a treaty as soon as possible. There was continual piracy going on, including hostage-taking and so forth. And the parties involved didn't want to negotiate another one and rather just sort of bit the bullet and accepted the one in front of them. I have some responses to that. I think that first and foremost, I as a separationist, would observe that the evidence doesn't seem to particularly support such a contention. We don't have any evidence in any official records, correspondence, memoirs, etc., that this was the case. And moreover, I think we would have such evidence if it were true. It's not as if this article in the treaty sort of snuck by without anyone really knowing about it. I've already mentioned how it was unanimous vote, Pickering, Adams in the newspaper, and so on. But even after that, it was noted quite frequently. Historian Morton Borden notes in his book entitled Jews, Turks, and Infidels that, quote, Article 11 had been cited hundreds of times in numerous court cases and in political debates whenever the issue of church-state relations arose. Jews frequently referred to the article in discussions of much debated question whether or not the U.S. was a Christian nation, unquote. Also, many of the ratifying senators lived for decades after unanimously accepting the treaty in 1797. President John Adams lived lucidly for 29 years afterwards. Pickering lived another 33 years after that. All of these individuals, one would think, would have had ample time to, quote, set the record straight, unquote, if indeed there was that duress operating. One last point, too, is while Tripoli was certainly causing problems, it was not the strongest of the Barbary states compared to Morocco and Algeria and Tunis, for example. But it was nettlesome, to be sure. And my sense is that although there was a sense of urgency, I'm not sure, but that if what the accommodationists are saying is true, that there wouldn't have been some resistance even to going along with the treaty for purposes of exigency. I mean, today, for example, I can't imagine a treaty like this not receiving a blizzard of criticism from the far right. And if the far right seems to be arguing that the sentiments that they have now were the sentiments that existed then, I think we would have expected somebody somewhere at some point to make an objection that we shouldn't be compromising our values for this purpose. And as I say, to my knowledge, we don't see that. So I think My final summary, before we let Hugh get a word in here, is I don't think this is conclusive smoking gun kind of evidence. I do think it is a reasonable piece of evidence to put with other pieces of evidence to make the case that indeed the idea that the United States was universally accepted as a nation, a Christian nation, is certainly challengeable.
Well, let's go back and set the stage here. It's 1796. We've got no navy. We urgently need this treaty. Adams himself is from New England, and the New Englanders are very anxious about being able to trade, as is the entire coast of America, without having piracy. Also, they're dealing with these Muslims with this reputation as really barbarians. The Barbary states were nominally under the rule of Turkey, but only nominally. They weren't very well controlled by it. So these are real barbarians we're dealing with. Later in United States history, and possibly earlier when we dealt with the Indians, we took the view that we could say anything we like to the Indians and it really didn't mean anything to us, that it had no significance with our country. I can see them putting this treaty through, especially unanimously. It's like, look, let's just get this thing done, get it out of the way. The Bay of Tripoli was one of the most obnoxious of the Barbary pirates. We had a few run-ins with Algiers. We never had any trouble with Morocco after the beginning, but he just didn't want to stay with the treaty at all, and we had to go back several times. In signing treaties with the other Barbary states, we have something like 6 or 7 of them, including later treaties with Tripoli, and I think another one with Algiers. When we did have leverage, when we had the U.S. Constellation inside his harbor knocking his ships apart, and Marines boarding his ships, and we signed a treaty when we had leverage, this thing never went in there. We never put this clause in any other treaty that we ever signed with anyone else. We wouldn't be putting it in a treaty with most anyone else except a non-Christian nation that was concerned about Christianity. There is a later clause that is similar to what my mother would say when all of the kids would come over to my house and she needed to get them cleared out. She'd say, let's play mouse, everybody in their own house. And this says the same thing about religion. It says, let's let everybody do their own religion and nobody interfere with anything else. It's a freedom of religion clause that does occur in one of the later treaties, but not this. And I think still that an argument could be made, first, that there was duress involved, and second, that possibly it didn't matter what we said to the Barbary pirates, so long as we got them to lay off our darn ships. And that makes me worry that this thing could be a weak reed to base the non-Christian nation idea on. I am interested in some of this court case stuff. Not many people know that the order of precedence of law in the United States, as said in the Constitution, is that a treaty trumps every single law, every state law, every federal law. The Congress can't override a treaty unless it overrides the treaty itself with a 2/3 Senate majority and the president involved. So they can't pass a law against a treaty. A treaty sits just below the Constitution, so it's a very, very heavy piece of law.
Well, I think you've made a good deal of sense, and as I try to pull my punches a little bit, the duress argument is something we can't rule out. I took particular note of when you said the comparison with how we treat the Indians, and then we don't really have to sort of be worried about anything we say to them. We can say anything we want to them, and saying that maybe that applied also in this particular case. But if it did, it could also apply on the other side as well. If it didn't matter, we could say anything we want to them, then one might say, well, why put that particular clause in that article, since there were treaties with other, as you point out, with other Barbary states about the same time and then and afterwards, And apparently the presence or absence of that clause was not a deal breaker. And especially, oddly enough, if the first objection that some of the separationists have come up with, the fact that it wasn't even in the Arabic version, is true, then that further indicates that it's not something that had to be included in there, otherwise the Bey wouldn't sign or something like that. It seems like it could make it even odder as to why that's in there. Let me hesitate a guess here, and it's certainly not original with me. Many people have suggested it. What we probably have here is Joel Barlow at work, the diplomat. He originally was a chaplain, Congregationalist chaplain with Washington in the Continental Army, but subsequently drifted toward a deism with his friend Jefferson. And he was strongly on record, both before and after this, as being in favor of church-state separation. It is conceivable that he actually put this in the English version when it wasn't in the Arabic version for his own purposes, to make this point. And I'm willing to grant that, because I still think the interesting point is the reaction to it, or better yet, the lack of the reaction to it. And I think that also still fights for acceptance with the duress argument. I think they're both should be considered.
Well, the Bey of Tripoli was a real stinker and a real pain in the neck. He actually didn't abide very well by this treaty. And even after we'd sent in the Marines and beat the daylights out of him, he comes back when the ships have gone home and said, "Can we go back to the previous treaty?" And he gets a wonderful answer from Madison, who says, "Look," he says, "peace is better than war," but he says, "war is better than tribute. Live with it."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This thing could have been agreed to in negotiations in Tripoli, and because of the long delays involved in getting things done, I mean, after all, some years later, we fought the entire Battle of New Orleans some months after the treaty with England had been signed. And it turns out that wasn't even the last battle of that war. There was some archaeological work recently about a ship battle off the coast of the Carolinas that was the actual last battle of that war. So there's these months and months of delay, and by the time this thing floated by, the Bey might not have cared, but then history shows he really didn't care about the treaty anyway. He was determined to continue doing whatever he wanted to do and get his tribute. Mm-hmm. He was a real stinker of the bunch. The other Barbary operations may have just been business as usual. Here, sign here, where's your money, fine, bye. But not this guy. So there is that argument. Yeah. As far as not dealing with barbarians, much later, in the 1870s, you have Phil Sheridan, who's head of the United States Army at that time, after Grant, saying, and I think I'm quoting here, "When dealing with the Indian, there is no possible question of American honor," which specifically meant that we didn't have to honor a damn thing we ever told them or signed with them. So that comes at the end of the century. And in doing research for this, I have to wonder if this same attitude may have begun here or earlier in dealing with the Indians. Now, I know that Washington was very concerned about a treaty he signed before the Revolution with the Indians somewhere in the New England area, that it in fact should be honored. But again, moving forward a little bit, you have the Trail of Tears under Andrew Jackson, where the Supreme Court upholds what we do, and Jackson says, well, you know, Justice Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it. So there's this attitude, and it may have been that as to what we said to them, nobody gave a damn. That would be an argument that I would make as a right Christian, that the reason it was unanimous, the reason you didn't get objection, is because nobody gave a damn so long as we got the treaty.
Well, again, that's...
I can't tell because I didn't look at the newspaper stuff from the time.
Yeah. Well, the newspaper, from what I got, the newspapers printed the treaty just simply straight out, but there doesn't seem to be any record of any disagreement or collective drawing of breath, like, oh my goodness, what's this all about? And that's the part that intrigues me. I can understand your point about maybe the senators got together in closed session and said, look, we don't like this, but we simply need it and so forth. But it's hard to imagine that somebody somewhere didn't get upset and make a fuss. And once again, the absence of that does seem to give some support to the notion that it was generally acknowledged that this was more or less not necessarily understood as a nation founded as a Christian nation, because of the absence of that sort of dust-up. But I think another thing to keep in mind too, and I said this in the beginning of my presentation, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this is not an all or nothing thing. Those people who are separationists are not claiming that this alone is all that one needs. At best, it is used in conjunction with other pieces of evidence to make an overall case on this issue. And I think, frankly, most accommodationists accept that too and see it as not establishing their position either. And it just leads to a much broader debate about other factors.
I would think that one of the strongest arguments for separation of church and state is the preamble of the Constitution, which is patterned directly after a royal proclamation, which would have begun, we, King George III, by the grace of God, King of England, Ireland, and Scotland, do hereby establish and ordain, and go on from there. Yes. They pulled we, King George III, right out. The we for King George is a royal we. They left the we in, but the grace of God got pulled also. And any mention of God anywhere in the Constitution is utterly absent. It could have been put in if they had the intention to do so, but it seems to me that they had the specific intention not to do so. I think it would be interesting to compare similar documents from that time to see if the Constitution was in fact unique for having no mention of God in it.
Excellent point, and you're absolutely right. The idea, the intention was to establish sovereignty on the basis of the people, not on the basis of a divine being or a particular ruler like the king. And I think that's a very powerful, much more powerful than Article 11, frankly.
Again, the Declaration of Independence, which was a document meant to garner support, talks about our being endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. But the Constitution itself, which could have, if it wanted to stay in the same vein, talk about endowment by the Creator with certain rights, either there or in the subsequent Bill of Rights. But they didn't do that at all. So this is a sharp difference here.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I was going to say something, but I'm not sure.
Well, go ahead. We got to start now.
Very quickly, one of the things that sometimes the accommodationists bring up is that the clause in the First Amendment, which says that, in fact, no religion shall be established, that should be interpreted to mean that the government should stay neutral between and among religions, but not religion and non-religion. And the point I wanted to make here is a lawyer named Robert Hurd delved into the records and found out that, in fact, the idea that it should be neutral among religions was actually rejected by the Senate in place of what we have now. So,
well, thank you very much, Richard. This has been Hugh Henry for Freethought Forum, and I hope you've had fun with this discussion of the Treaty of Tripoli and the pirates.
I think as I please, and this gives me pleasure.
My conscience decrees, this right I must treasure.
My thoughts will not cater
To duke or dictator, no person can deny. Digadonken sin